Mr. and Mrs Juzio. One night, my father came home from the office all excited. He told Mr. and Mrs Yarby were coming to New York. He was the president of Juzio's company. He lives in Chicago. I wondered if he'd bring my father another crate of Juzio. If he did, I'd probably be drinking it for the rest of my life. Just thinking about it was enough to make my stomach hurt. My father said he invited Mr. and Mrs. Yarby to stay with us. My mother wanted to know why they couldn't stay in a hotel like most people who come to New York. My father said they could, but he didn't want them to. He thought they'd be more comfortable staying with us. My mother said that was about the silliest thing she'd ever heard. But she had to fix up Fudge's bedroom and our guest room, and she put a fancy sheets on and brand new blankets and a hide-a-bed and a sofa that opens up into a bed at night. It's in Fudge's room because that used to be our den. Before he was born, we watched TV in there. And lots of times, Grandpa slept over on the hide-a-bed. Now we watch TV right in the living room. And Grandpa, he doesn't sleep over it very often. My mother moved Fudge's crib into my room. He's going to get a rectangular bed when he's 3, my mother says. There are lots of reasons I don't like to sleep in the same room with Fudge. I found out 2 months ago when my bedroom was being painted, I had to sleep in Fudge's room for 3 nights because the smell of paint made me cough. For one thing, he talks in his sleep. And if a person didn't know better, a person could get scared. Another thing is that slurping noise he makes. It's true that I like to hear it when I'm awake, but when I'm trying to fall asleep, I like things very quiet. When I complained about having to sleep with Fudge, my mother said, "It's just for 2 nights, Peter." "I'll sleep in the living room," I suggested, "on the sofa, or in even a chair." "No," my mother said. "You will sleep in your bedroom, in your own bed." There was no point in arguing. Mom wasn't going to change her mind. She spent the day in the kitchen. She was really cooking up a storm. She used so many pots and pans, Fudge didn't have any left to bang together. And that's one of his favorite pastimes, banging pots and pans together. A person can get an awful headache listening to that racket. Right after lunch, my mother opened the dinner table. We don't have separate dining rooms when we have company for dinner. We eat in one end of the living room. When my mother finished setting the table, she put out the big silver bowl filled with flowers right in the middle. I said, "Hey, Mom, it looks like we're expecting the president or something." "Very funny, Peter," my mother answered. Sometimes my mother laughs like crazy at my jokes, and other times she pretends not to get them. And then there are times when I know she gets them, but she doesn't seem to like them. This was one of those times, so I decided no more jokes until after dinner. I went to Jimmy Fargo's for the afternoon. I came home at 4 o'clock. I found my mother standing over the dinner table mumbling. Fudge was on the floor playing with my father's socks. I'm not sure why he likes socks so much, but if you give him a few pairs, he'll play quietly for an hour. I said, "Hi, Mom, I'm home." "I'm missing 2 flowers, my mother said. I don't know how she noticed that 2 flowers were missing from her silver bowl, because there were at least a dozen of them left. But sure enough, when I checked, I saw that 2 stems with nothing on them. "Don't look at me, Mom," I said. "What would I do with 2 measly flowers?" So we both looked at Fudge. "Did you take Mommy's pretty flowers?" Mommy asked him. "No take," said Fudge. And he was chewing on something. "What's in your mouth?" my mother asked. Fudge didn't answer. "Show Mommy." "No show," said Fudge. "Oh, yes." My mother picked him up and forced his mouth open. When she finished, fished out a rose petal. "What do you do with Mommy's flowers?" She raised her voice. She was really getting upset. Fudge laughed. "Ah, tell Mommy." "Yum," said Fudge. "Yummy, yummy, yummy, yummy." "Oh, no," Mother cried, rushing to the telephone. She called Dr. Cone. She told him that Fudge ate 2 flowers. Dr. Cone must have asked her what kind, because my mother said, "Roses, I think, but I can't be sure. One might have been a daisy." There was a long pause, and my mother listened to whatever Dr. Cone had to say. The mom said, "Thank you, Dr. Cohn." She hung up. "No more flowers," she told Fudge. "You understand?" "No more," Fudge said, repeated. "No more. No more. No more." My mother gave him a spoonful of peppermint-flavored medicine, the kind I take when I have a stomach ache, and she started to carry Fudge off to have his bath. Leave it to my brother to eat flowers. I wonder how they tasted. Maybe they were delicious, and I don't know it because I've never tasted one, I thought. I just decided to find out, so I picked one petal off from a pink rose. I put it in my mouth and tried to chew it, but I couldn't do it. It tasted awful. I spit it out in the garbage. Well, at least now I know. I knew I wasn't missing anything great. Fudge ate his supper in the kitchen before our company arrived. While he was eating, I heard Mom remind him, "Fudge's going to be a good boy tonight. Very good for Daddy's friends." "Good," Fudge said. "Good boy." "That's right," Mommy told him. I changed and scrubbed up while Fudge finished the supper. I was going to eat with the company, being 9 and has its advantages. My mother was all dressed up by the time my father got home with the Yarbys. You'd never have guessed that my mom spent most of the day in the kitchen. You'd never have guessed that Fudge ate 2 flowers. He was feeling fine. Even smelled nice, like baby powder. Mrs. Yarby picked him up right away. I knew she would. She looked like a grandmother. That type always makes a big deal out of Fudge. She walked into the living room, cuddling him, then sat down on the sofa and bounced Fudge around on her lap. "Isn't he the cutest little boy?" Mrs. Yarby said. "I just love babies," she said, and she gave him a big kiss on the top of his head. I kept waiting for somebody to tell her that Fudge was no baby, but no one did. My father carried the Yarby suitcase to Fudge's room. Then he came back and introduced me to our company. "This is our elder son, Peter," he said to the Yarbys. "I'm 9. I'm in 4th grade," I told him. "How do you do, Peter?" Mr. Yarby said. Mrs. Yarby just gave me a nod. She was still busy with Fudge. "I have a surprise for you, dear little boy," she said. "In my suitcase. Should I go get it?" "Yes," Fudge shouted. Go get! Go get!" Mrs. Yarby laughed, as if that was the best joke she'd ever heard. "I'll be right back," she told Fudge, and she put him down and ran to find her suitcase. She came back carrying a present, tied up with a red ribbon. "Ooh," Fudge cried, opening his eyes wide. "Goody!" Clapped his hands. Mrs. Yarby helped him unwrap the surprise. It was a wind-up train that made lots of noise. Every time it bumped into something and turned around, it went the other way. Fudge liked it a lot. He likes anything that's noisy. I said, "That's a nice train." Mrs. Yarby turned to me. "Oh, I have something for you, too. Peter?" I reminded her. "Yes, my name is Peter." "Yes, well, I'll go get it." Mrs. Yarby left the room again. This time, she came back with a flat package. It was wrapped up, too, with a red ribbon. She handed it to me. Fudge stopped playing with his train long enough to come over and see what I got. I took off the paper very carefully in case my mother wanted to save it. Also to show Mrs. Yarby that I was a lot more careful with things than my brother. I'm not sure she noticed. My present turned out to be a big picture dictionary, the kind like I liked when I was about 4 years old. My old one is Fudge's bookcase now. "I don't know how much about big boys," said Mrs. Yarby. "So the lady at the store said a nice book would be a good idea." Nice book would have been a good idea, I thought, but a picture dictionary? That's for babies. I had my own regular dictionary since I was 8, but I knew I had to be polite and say thank you very much. It's just what I've always wanted. "Oh, I'm so glad," said Mrs. Yarby. And then she let out a long sigh, and then back on the sofa. My father offered the Yarbys a drink. Good idea, said Mr. Yarby. "What'll it be?" my father asked. "What'll it be?" Mr. Yarby repeated, laughing. "What do you think, Hatcher?" "It'll be Juzio. That's all we ever drink. Good for your health." Mr. Yarby pounded his chest. "Of course," my father said, like he knew it all along. "Juzio for everyone," my father told my mother, and she went to the kitchen to get it. While my father and Mr. Yarby were discussing Juzios, Fudge disappeared, just as my mother served everyone a glass of Mr. Yarby's favorite drink. When he came back, he was carrying a book My old worn-out picture dictionary, the same as the one the Yarbys just gave me. See? Fudge said, climbing up on Mrs. Yarby's lap. See? Book! I wanted to vanish. I think my mother and father did too. See? Book! Now Fudge held it up over his head. I can use another one, I explained. I really can. That's an old one, and it's falling apart. I tried to laugh. It's returnable, Mrs. Yarby said. It's silly to keep it if you already have one. She sounded insulted, like it was like my fault or something. She bought me something I already had. Mine, Fudge said. He closed the book and held it onto it tight. Mine, mine, mine. It's the thought that counts, my mother said. It was so nice of you to think of our boys. Then she turned to Fudge. Put the book away now, Fudge. Isn't it Fudge's bedtime? My father hinted. Oh, yes, I think it is, my mother said, scooping him up. Say good night, Fudgy. Good night, Fudgy, my brother said, waving to us. Fudge was supposed to fall asleep before we sat down to dinner, but just in case, my mother put a million little toys in his crib to keep him busy. I don't know who my mother thought she was fooling, because we all knew that Fudge can climb out of that crib any old time he wants to. He stayed away until we were in the middle of our roast beef. Then he came carrying Dribble's bowl. He walked right up to Mrs. Yarby, thought she was his new friend. See? He said, holding Dribble under her nose. See, Dribble? Mrs. Yarby shrieked. Oh! I can't stand reptiles. Get that thing away from me. Fudgy looked disappointed, so now he showed Dribble to Mr. Yarby. See? He said. Hatcher! Mr. Yarby boomed. Make him get that thing out of here. I wonder why Mr. Yarby called my father Hatcher. Didn't he know his first name was Warren? And I didn't like the way Mr. and Mrs. Yarby both called Dribble a thing. I jumped up. Give him to me, I told Fudge. I took Dribble in his bowl and marched into my room. I inspected my turtle all over. He seemed all right. I didn't want to make a big scene in front of our company, but I was mad. I mean, really mad. That kid knows he's not allowed to touch my turtle. Peter, my father called, come out here and finish your dinner. When I got back to the table, I heard Mrs. Yarby say, It must be interesting to have children. We never had any ourselves. But if we did, Mr. Yarby told my father, we'd teach them some manners. I'm a firm believer in old-fashioned good manners. So are we, Howard, my father said in a weak voice. I thought Mr. Yarby had a lot of nerve to say we had no manners. Did I not pretend to like that dumb old dictionary? If that wasn't good manners, then I don't know what was. My mother excused herself, carried Fudge back into the room. I guess she put him in his crib again, and I hoped she told him to keep his hands off my things. We didn't hear from him until dessert. Just as my mother was pouring the coffee, he ran in wearing my rubber gorilla mask from last Halloween. It's even real-looking mask. I guess that's why Mrs. Yarby screamed so loud. If she hadn't made so much noise, my mother's probably wouldn't have spilled the coffee all over the floor. My father grabbed Fudge, pulled the gorilla mask off him. That's not funny, Fudge. He said, Funny! Fudge laughed. Funny, funny, funny. Yes, sir, Hatcher, Mr. Yarby said. Old-fashioned manners. By the time I'm sure my father was sorry the Yarbys weren't staying at a hotel. So I finally went to bed at 10. Fudge was in the crib slurping away. I thought I'd never fall asleep, but I guess I did. I woke up once when Fudgy started babbling. He said, boo, ba, boom, 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 boo, boo, booshi. Whatever that means. I don't even get scared. I whispered, Shut up. And he did. Early the next morning, I felt something funny on my arm. At first, I didn't wake up. I just felt this little tickle. I thought it was part of my dream. But then I had the feeling it was somebody staring at me. So I opened my eyes. Fudgy was standing over me, and Dribble was scrawling around on my arm. I guess Fudgy could tell I was about ready to kill him because he bent down and kissed me. That's what he does to when my mother gets angry at him. He thinks nobody can resist him when he makes himself so lovable. And a lot of times it works with my mother, but not with me. I jumped up, put Dribble back in his bowl, and smacked Fudge on his backside hard. he hollered. My father came running into the room. He was still in his pajamas. He whispered, "What's going on in here?" I pointed at Fudge, and Fudge pointed at me. My father picked up my brother and carried him off. "Go back to sleep, Peter," he said. "It's only 1 o'clock in the morning." I fell asleep for another hour, and he woke up to an awful noise. It was Fudge playing with his new train. It woke everybody up, including the Yarbys. But this time, there was nobody they could blame. They were the ones who gave Fudge the train in the first place. Breakfast was a very quiet affair. Nobody had much to say, and Mr. Yarby drank 2 glasses of Juzio, and then he told my father that he and Mrs. Yarby had their suitcases packed and they were leaving for the hotel as soon as breakfast was over. My father said he understood and that the apartments were too small for so many people. My mother didn't say anything. When Mr. Yarby went to Fudge's bedroom to pick up his suitcase, a voice screamed, "Hatcher!" My father ran towards the bedroom. My mother and Mrs. Yarby followed him. I followed him. When they got there, they found Fudge sitting on the Yarby suitcase. He had decorated it with 100 green stamps, the kind that my mother gets from the supermarket. "See?" Fudge said, "See? Pretty." He laughed. Nobody else did. Then he licked the last green stamp and stuck it right in the middle of the suitcase. "All gone," Fudge sang, holding up his hands. It took my mother half an hour to peel off all those trading stamps and clean up the Darby suitcase. The next week, my father came home from the office and collected all the cans of Juzio in our house. He dumped them into the garbage. My mother felt bad that my father had lost such an important account. But my father had told her not to worry. Juzio wasn't selling very well at the stores. Nobody seemed to like it, the combination of oranges, grapefruits, pineapples, pears, and bananas. "You know, Dad," I said, "I only drank Juzio to be polite. I really hated it." "You know something funny, Peter?" my father said. "I thought it was pretty bad myself."